Jason Reed sat quietly in the corner of the bustling coffee shop, his wheelchair tucked neatly under the small wooden table. The air buzzed with the hum of conversation, clinking cups, and the hiss of the espresso machine, but Jason barely noticed any of it. His ball cap, faded from years of wear, was pulled low over his face, shadowing his sharp, weathered features. In his hand, he cradled a plain white mug filled with black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just as he liked it. He sipped slowly, savoring the bitter warmth. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another man seeking a quiet moment away from the chaos of the world. But Jason Reed wasn't just another man. The jacket slung over the back of his chair bore a worn Navy SEAL trident pin, a tiny golden emblem that told a story few would ever dare to imagine. The symbol was small, but to those who recognized it, it spoke of courage, discipline, and unimaginable sacrifice. Jason didn't wear it to boast. He wore it because it was a part of who he was, a reminder of a life that seemed so far away now. 5 years had passed since the day that changed everything. The day his legs were taken by a roadside bomb in a distant desert, leaving him bound to a wheelchair. The explosion had ripped through his convoy, shattering metal, bone, and lives in a matter of seconds. He had survived, though some days, survival felt like a hollow victory. The scars that crisscrossed his body were only part of the burden he carried. The invisible wounds, the memories of friends lost, the sleepless nights, the constant battle against pain were far heavier. But Jason wasn't the type to complain. He had learned long ago that life didn't slow down for anyone, no matter how broken they felt inside. So he adapted. He pushed forward, even when the world seemed determined to push him back. To most people in the coffee shop, Jason was just that guy in the wheelchair. He was used to the stares, the awkward glances, and the overly polite smiles that people gave him when they didn't know what else to do. Most people didn't bother to see past the wheels, and Jason didn't go out of his way to correct them. He preferred it that way. The less people knew, the fewer questions they asked. But today, Jason was about to get more attention than he wanted. The coffee shop was unusually crowded for a Tuesday afternoon. Every table was filled with groups of students hunched over laptops, young professionals taking meetings, and the occasional parent chasing after a restless child. Jason had chosen his corner seat because it offered a clear view of the room while keeping him out of the way. He liked to observe people, the way they moved, the way they talked, the little habits they probably didn't even realize they had. It was something he had done during his years as a SEAL, a skill that had saved his life more times than he could count. His sharp eyes scanned the room as he took another sip of coffee. A young man with a guitar case struggled to navigate through the crowd, bumping chairs and muttering apologies. A woman at the counter waved her hands animatedly as she spoke into her phone, her latte forgotten on the counter. 2 teenage girls giggled over something on a phone screen, oblivious to the world around them. Jason didn't miss much. It was a habit he couldn't turn off, even if he wanted to. He noticed the details, the nervous tap of a foot, the way someone's eyes darted around the room, the tension in a stranger's shoulders. He could read people like a book, though he rarely let them know it. As he sat there, the door swung open, letting in a burst of cold air and the sound of laughter. A group of young men stepped inside, their voices loud enough to cut through the noise of the cafe. Jason's eyes flicked to them instinctively. There were 3 of them, college-aged, dressed in the kind of casual clothes that were meant to look effortless but probably cost more than Jason's monthly groceries. One of them, tall and lanky with a backwards baseball cap, seemed to be the leader. His friends trailed behind him, laughing at something he had said. Jason didn't think much of them at first. Groups like that were common in places like this, loud, confident, full of energy. They were the type of guys who probably never thought twice about someone like him. But then, the tall one glanced around the room, his gaze landing on Jason. A slow smirk spread across his face, and Jason felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't the first time he had been looked at like that, like he was some kind of easy target. He had seen that look before, in different places, on different faces. The group moved further into the cafe, their laughter drawing a few annoyed glances from other patrons. Jason kept his eyes on them, his expression calm and unreadable. He had learned to stay composed, no matter the situation. Letting people see your emotions was a weakness, and Jason didn't do weakness. The tall one, the leader, whispered something to his friends, and they all glanced in Jason's direction. One of them snickered, and Jason could feel the weight of their attention settling on him. He didn't move. He didn't react. He just waited. He knew what was coming. It always started the same way: casual comments, a few jokes, maybe a question or two that seemed innocent at first. Then it would escalate. Jason had dealt with enough bullies in his life to recognize the pattern. They always thought they were in control, that they could push him around because he didn't fight back right away. What they didn't know was that Jason Reed was a man who had been tested in ways they couldn't even imagine. He had faced danger that would make their worst fears look like child's play. He had survived battles, both on the battlefield and within himself. And if they thought his wheelchair made him weak, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. As the group made their way toward his corner, Jason set his coffee cup down and adjusted his position in the chair. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if trouble came to him, he wouldn't shy away from it. The tall one stepped closer, his smirk growing wider. His friends hung back a step, their laughter quieter now, like they were waiting to see what would happen next. Jason kept his eyes on the leader, his expression calm but alert. Today was supposed to be just another quiet day at the coffee shop. But Jason could already tell it was going to be anything but that. Jason adjusted his ball cap, his hand moving in slow, deliberate motion. It was a subtle signal, not to anyone else, but to himself, a reminder to stay calm and measured. He had faced far greater dangers than 3 smug kids in a coffee shop. But still, there was something about their approach that put his instincts on edge. The leader, tall and wiry with a sharp, angular face, leaned casually against a nearby table. His fingers drummed against the wood as he looked Jason over, his smirk growing more confident. He didn't say anything at first, letting the weight of his gaze do the work. Jason had seen this tactic before: an attempt to intimidate, to make the target squirm under scrutiny. Jason didn't move. He simply stared back, his calm, steady gaze meeting the kid's eyes without flinching. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't defiance. It was just presence, unshaken, unbothered. Finally, the kid spoke. "Hey, old man. This place get boring for you, or is this your usual haunt?" Jason didn't respond right away. He sipped his coffee, the mug warm in his hands, and set it back down on the table. The group chuckled, their leader glancing over his shoulder to make sure his buddies were paying attention. "Quiet type, huh?" the leader said, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's the deal? Don't like company? Or are you just too grumpy to talk?" The 2 boys behind him snickered, but Jason remained silent. He had no interest in playing their game. "Look at him," one of the friends whispered loudly, as if Jason couldn't hear. "Bet he's been sitting there all day. Probably doesn't even have anywhere else to go." Jason's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. The comments weren't new, and they didn't sting the way the kids probably hoped they would. Words like that didn't matter, not when you'd faced death and survived. But then, the leader took a step closer. "You know," he said, his tone shifting to something more pointed, "this place gets busy. Tables are hard to come by. Maybe you should move along and let someone else have this spot." Jason finally looked up, his gaze sharp and deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was low and calm. "There are plenty of empty tables." He nodded toward the open seats scattered around the cafe. The leader followed Jason's nod, his smirk faltering for a fraction of a second before it returned. "Yeah, "But this one's the best," he said, leaning forward slightly. "And me and my friends? We like the best." Jason met his gaze without blinking. "Then you'd better get here earlier next time." The leader's friends burst out laughing, but it wasn't the reaction he had hoped for. The smirk on his face wavered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He straightened up, brushing off his jacket like Jason's words hadn't just cut through his bravado. "You've got a mouth on you for a guy in a wheelchair," the leader said, his tone sharper now. "But you don't scare me." Jason's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile. "I'm not trying to scare you," he said. The leader stepped closer, his posture stiffening as he loomed over Jason's table. His friends hovered a step behind him, their expressions uncertain. Jason could tell they weren't entirely on board with their leader's antics, but peer pressure was a powerful thing. "You think you're tough, huh?" the leader asked, his voice dropping as he leaned in. "Sitting there all quiet like you're better than me." Jason's eyes didn't waver. "I don't think I'm better than you," he said evenly. "But I'm starting to think you're not as tough as you want people to believe." The cafe seemed to grow quieter. Nearby conversation slowed, and Jason could feel the weight of curious eyes turning toward them. The leader's face flushed, a mixture of anger and embarrassment flashing in his expression. He opened his mouth to respond, but one of his friends nudged him from behind. "Come on, man," the friend said, his voice low. "Let's just grab another table. It's not a big deal." The leader jerked his arm away, glaring at his friend before turning back to Jason. "Nah, this guy wants to act tough. Let's see how tough he really is." Jason sighed softly, leaning back in his chair. He had been hoping to finish his coffee in peace, but it seemed that wasn't in the cards today. Still, he wasn't about to let some kid with a chip on his shoulder ruin his afternoon. "Let me give you some advice," Jason said, his tone calm but firm. "You don't want to go down this road." The leader scoffed, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Jason could see it, the uncertainty, the momentary doubt. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell him that the kid wasn't as sure of himself as he pretended to be. "You don't scare me," the leader said again, but his voice lacked the same confidence as before. Jason tilted his head slightly, studying the boy in front of him. "Maybe not," he said quietly. "But I've seen things that would." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The leader blinked, his bravado slipping for a moment as he tried to process what Jason meant. One of the other customers, an older woman sitting near the counter, cleared her throat loudly. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice sharp. "You're making a scene." The leader glanced over his shoulder, his expression twisting into a scowl. "Mind your own business, lady," he snapped, but his tone lacked conviction. Jason took another sip of his coffee, his gaze steady as he watched the boy's confidence unravel. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone. All he had to do was wait, and eventually, the truth would reveal itself. The leader took a step back, his movements jerky and uncertain. His friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances as they realized the situation wasn't going the way they had expected. "Whatever," the leader muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "This place is lame anyway." He turned on his heel and marched toward the door, his friends trailing behind him. Jason watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't feel anger or satisfaction, just a quiet sense of relief that the confrontation had ended without escalating further. As the door closed behind them, the cafe slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, and the tension in the air dissipated. Jason leaned back in his chair, taking another sip of his coffee. He didn't need thanks or recognition. He was just glad to have his peace back, if only for a little while. The cafe buzzed softly with murmured conversations and the hiss of steaming milk, but the noise dulled as the boy's voice cut through the air again. What's the matter, Wheels? Cat got your tongue? Jason set his coffee cup down gently, the ceramic clinking against the saucer. He wasn't one to rise to bait. His calmness often worked like a mirror, reflecting more about the other person than himself. But in this moment, he wasn't just gauging the boy's words, he was studying everything. The leader's stance, the subtle hesitations in his friend's body language, and the way the surrounding customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The boy's smirk widened as he mistook Jason's silence for weakness. He glanced back at his friends, a silent signal of dominance. Encouraged by their chuckles, he pulled out a chair at Jason's table, turning it backward before straddling it. He sat too close, his knee nearly brushing against the wheel of Jason's chair. "You think you're pretty special, huh?" the boy asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Sitting here like you own the place. What's your story, huh? How'd you end up like that?" He gestured to Jason's legs, then leaned back casually, as though his words didn't sting like needles. Jason met his gaze, unflinching. His voice was steady, low, and unbothered. "I'm just here to enjoy my coffee." But that answer wasn't enough for the boy. He leaned in closer, his grin widening. "See, I don't think that's it. I think you're sitting here because you've got nowhere else to go. Nobody else to hang out with. People like you, you're invisible until someone like me notices." One of the boy's friends shifted awkwardly, glancing toward the door as if debating whether to stick around. "Hey, man," he muttered, his voice low, "maybe we should just..." The leader cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Nah, it's fine. I'm just having a conversation." He turned back to Jason, his voice mockingly soft. "So, what's the deal, huh? You got in a little accident? Fell off your tricycle?" The cafe grew quieter still. A barista behind the counter froze mid-pour, her eyes flickering between the confrontation and the manager hovering in the back. No one moved. Jason let the boy's words hang in the air for a moment. He could feel the tension thickening, each second stretching longer than the last. Slowly, he reached for his coffee, lifting the mug to his lips for a deliberate sip before setting it down again. "My story's none of your business," Jason said finally, his tone even. The leader's grin faltered slightly, but only for a moment. He wasn't used to people brushing him off. "Oh, come on, man," he said, his voice louder now. "We're all dying to know. What'd you do to end up in that chair? Did you trip over your own feet? Or maybe," he leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "maybe you're one of those guys who couldn't cut it? The kind that folds under pressure." Jason's eyes darkened, but he didn't let the anger show on his face. He'd seen this kind of posturing before. It wasn't about the words, it was about control. The kid wanted a reaction, wanted to feel powerful by making someone else feel small. Instead of rising to the bait, Jason leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You seem awfully interested in me," he said quietly. "Why's that?" The boy blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected response. For a moment, he hesitated, his confidence wavering under Jason's steady gaze. But then his bravado returned, fueled by the laughter of his friends. "Why?" the boy echoed, grinning again. "Because it's fun. Guys like you quiet, alone, pretending not to care? You're the easiest targets." Jason tilted his head, studying the boy with a piercing gaze that made him shift in his seat. "Easiest targets, huh?" he repeated softly. "You sure about that?" The leader opened his mouth to respond, but something in Jason's tone made him pause. It wasn't a threat, at least, not an overt one. But there was a weight to Jason's words, an undercurrent of something unspoken. One of the boy's friends tugged at his sleeve, his voice more urgent now. "Seriously, man, let's go. This isn't worth it." But the leader shrugged him off again, unwilling to back down in front of an audience. He leaned forward, his expression hardening as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Yeah, I'm sure," he said, his voice laced with defiance. "What are you gonna do about it? Roll over my toes?" His friends laughed nervously, their amusement tinged with discomfort. Even they could sense that the situation was spiraling. Jason didn't respond right away. He let the boy's words hang in the air, his silence speaking louder than any retort. Slowly, he reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out a small object and placing it on the table between them. It was a worn metal pin, tarnished with age but unmistakable in its design, a Navy SEAL trident. The boy's laughter faltered as he glanced at the pin. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Jason didn't answer. He didn't need to. The trident spoke for itself, its meaning sinking in as the boy stared at it. The leader leaned back slightly, his bravado cracking under the weight of the realization. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, the tension in the room shifting as they began to grasp what they were dealing with. "You were military?" one of them asked hesitantly, breaking the silence. Jason's gaze didn't waver. "I was," he said simply. The leader swallowed hard, his earlier confidence now a distant memory. He tried to mask his unease with a forced laugh. "Well, I guess that's cool or whatever. But, like, what does that have to do with now?" Jason didn't answer immediately. He picked up the trident, turning it over in his fingers before tucking it back into his pocket. Then he looked up, his calm demeanor unshaken. "It means I've been through more than you can imagine," he said quietly. "And I've dealt with people a lot tougher than you." The boy's face turned red, his embarrassment evident as the rest of the cafe watched in silence. He glanced around, searching for a way to save face, but there was none. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Finally, the boy pushed back his chair and stood up, his movements stiff and awkward. "Whatever," he muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets. "This place is lame anyway." His friends followed him toward the door, their heads down as they avoided Jason's gaze. As they left, the buzz of conversation slowly returned, the tension dissipating like a storm that had passed. Jason leaned back in his chair, his coffee still warm in his hands. He didn't feel satisfaction or triumph, just a quiet sense of peace. The storm had passed, and for now, that was enough. Jason's eyes lingered on the door long after the boys had left. He felt the weight of the cafe's collective gaze, the subtle shift in how they saw him now. He had walked, or rather, rolled this path before. The pity, the admiration, and even the quiet discomfort that came when people realized the man they underestimated wasn't what he seemed. He sighed softly, lifting the coffee cup to his lips once more. The trident had done its job, as it always did. It was a simple symbol, but one that carried enough weight to disarm arrogance and silence questions. What it couldn't do, however, was erase the tension it left behind. Jason didn't seek out confrontation. He didn't crave the attention that came with moments like this. But trouble had a way of finding him, especially from those who saw his wheelchair and assumed it told the whole story. The barista behind the counter approached cautiously, holding a refill pot in one hand. She hesitated at his table, her face a mix of nervousness and something close to gratitude. Would you like a top-up?" she asked, her voice softer than before. Jason glanced at his cup and gave her a small smile. "Sure, thanks." As she poured, her eyes darted toward the door, where the boys had disappeared. "That was, something else," she said, her tone careful. Jason shrugged. "It happens." She tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "You handled it better than most people would." Jason didn't respond immediately. He'd heard variations of that line before, usually from people who meant well but didn't quite understand. Finally, he said, "It's easier when you've been through worse." Her brow furrowed, and he could see the questions forming in her mind. But to her credit, she didn't press. Instead, she offered a small smile and stepped back toward the counter. Jason appreciated her restraint. He wasn't in the mood to play storyteller. The cafe returned to its usual rhythm, but Jason remained on edge. Something about the leader of that group, the arrogance in his voice, the way he'd tried to assert dominance, nagged at him. It wasn't just the usual bravado of a kid trying to impress his friends. It was the kind of cocky, unchecked entitlement that often led to trouble. Jason's instincts, honed over years of surviving both the battlefield and life afterward, whispered that the encounter wasn't over. As he finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he caught movement outside the cafe window. The three boys were lingering near the curb, their backs to the street as they huddled in conversation. The leader's exaggerated gestures and loud voice carried faintly through the glass, and Jason knew exactly what they were talking about. With a resigned sigh, Jason adjusted the wheels of his chair and rolled toward the door. The late afternoon sun bathed the parking lot in golden light, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jason maneuvered his chair down the cafe's ramp, his expression calm but alert. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if it came, he wouldn't back down. The boys noticed him almost immediately. The leader smirked and nudged one of his friends, who hesitated before following along. "Well, look who decided to join us," the leader called out, stepping forward with his arms spread wide. "Done hiding behind your coffee?" Jason kept rolling, his pace steady and unhurried. "You're still here," he said evenly, stopping a few feet away. The boy tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Yeah, we figured we'd stick around. You know, just in case you wanted to finish our little chat." Jason scanned the area. The parking lot wasn't crowded, but a few bystanders lingered near their cars, their attention already shifting toward the brewing confrontation. "I thought we were done," Jason said. The leader's smile faded slightly, replaced by a harder edge. "See, that's the thing. I don't like being embarrassed. Especially not in front of my friends." Jason arched an eyebrow. "Embarrassed? You did that to yourself." The boy's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer. "You think you're funny, huh? Just because you threw some shiny pin on the table, I'm supposed to be impressed." One of the friends shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the leader and Jason. "Dude, let it go," he muttered. But the leader ignored him, his focus locked on Jason. "What's the deal, huh? You think being some war hero makes you better than us? Newsflash, it doesn't." Jason's patience was wearing thin, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Kid, I don't know what you're trying to prove here, but this isn't the way to do it." "Oh, I'll prove something," the boy shot back, his voice rising. "You think you're untouchable because you've got some sob story? Newsflash, old man, no one cares." Jason leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. He'd seen this kind of anger before, the kind that masked insecurity, the need to dominate because of some unspoken fear of being insignificant. "I don't need you to care," Jason said quietly. "But I'd suggest you walk away before this gets worse." The boys' friends were visibly uncomfortable now, their earlier bravado completely gone. One of them tugged at the leader's arm. "Come on, man. This is stupid." But the leader shook him off, his face flushed with frustration. He looked down at Jason, his voice dripping with contempt. "What are you gonna do? Run me over?" Jason's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to a tone so low and steady it sent a chill through the air. "You don't want to find out?" The boy hesitated, and for a brief moment, Jason thought he might back down. But then the leader took another step forward, raising his arm in a gesture that could have been a shove or worse. Jason reacted instinctively. Before the boy's hand could connect, Jason's left arm shot up, deflecting the movement with precise force. His grip locked onto the boy's wrist, twisting just enough to immobilize him without causing serious harm. The boy yelped, his bravado crumbling as Jason's strength caught him off guard. The parking lot froze. Jason's voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd spent years in high-pressure situations. That was a mistake. The boy's friends stood frozen, their eyes wide as they watched their leader struggle against Jason's iron grip. The bystanders nearby exchanged whispers, unsure whether to intervene. Jason released the boy's wrist, letting him stumble back a few steps. He adjusted his position in the chair, his eyes never leaving the leader. "Now, I'm going to say this one more time. Walk away." The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between Jason and his friends. He opened his mouth as if to argue but seemed to think better of it. Muttering something under his breath, he turned and stalked toward the sidewalk, his friends following closely behind. As they disappeared around the corner, the tension in the parking lot eased. Jason exhaled slowly, his body relaxing as the adrenaline began to fade. A man nearby approached cautiously, his face a mix of concern and admiration. "You okay?" he asked. Jason nodded. "I'm fine." The man shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You handled that better than I would have." Jason offered a small, tired smile. "It's not about handling it. It's about knowing when to end it." With that, he turned and wheeled toward his car, the distant echo of the boy's retreating footsteps fading into the background. Jason knew their type, the loud, insecure kind who thrived on attention. Bullies who wanted an easy target. But patience was his weapon, forged in the heat of high-stakes missions where impulsiveness cost lives. He wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. The leader leaned in closer, slapping Jason's table again, this time hard enough to rattle the coffee cup. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just scared?" Jason glanced at the boy, his gaze calm and measured. "Scared of what?" "You," he asked, his voice low but steady. The boy blinked, taken aback by the response. For a moment, his bravado faltered, but he quickly covered it with a smirk. "Yeah, scared of me. Or maybe you're just too old and slow to keep up anymore." Jason tilted his head, studying the boy like he was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. "You keep saying that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Trying to convince yourself." The boy's smirk faltered again, and this time his friends exchanged uneasy glances. The tension in the cafe was thick enough to cut with a knife. Customers pretended to focus on their phones or drinks, but their eyes flicked toward the confrontation, drawn to the quiet intensity of Jason's presence. Jason sipped his coffee again, his movements deliberate. He wasn't just stalling, he was observing, cataloging every detail. The leader was jittery, hiding insecurity beneath his bluster. The two friends were clearly followers, uncomfortable but too afraid to stand up to their ringleader. And the customers? Some were uneasy, but a few looked ready to step in if things escalated. One woman, a middle-aged teacher type, was gripping her phone tightly, poised to call for help. A man in a suit near the counter seemed torn between intervening and staying out of it. Jason filed these details away, his mind working like a chessboard. Every move mattered. "You're not gonna do anything, are you?" the leader sneered, stepping closer. "I mean, what could you do? You're just some guy in a wheelchair." Jason leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the armrests. "You're awfully fixated on the wheelchair," he said, his voice even. "Why's that?" The boy hesitated, thrown off by the question. "What?" Jason shrugged. "Seems like you've got a lot to prove. Picking on someone you think can't fight back. That's not strength. That's weakness." The boy's face darkened, and for a moment, Jason thought he might lash out. But then one of the friends grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Come on, man," the friend said quietly. "This is stupid. Let's go." But the leader shook him off, his jaw clenched. He wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. Jason could feel the momentum shifting. The leader's grip on his friends was loosening, and the crowd's silent judgment was growing heavier. Bullies like him thrived on an audience that feared them, but when the tide turned, they crumbled quickly. "Tell you what," Jason said suddenly, breaking the tension. "I'll make you a deal." The boy frowned, confused. "What kind of deal?" Jason gestured to the table. "You want the spot? Take it. But first, tell me why you need to." The boy's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" "You've got something to prove," Jason said, his voice calm but direct. "So go ahead. Tell me. What is it?" The boy hesitated, glancing at his friends. The bravado was slipping, replaced by uncertainty. Jason's question wasn't just a challenge, it was a spotlight, exposing the cracks in the leader's facade. "I don't need to prove anything," the boy muttered, his voice quieter now. "Then why are you still standing here?" Jason asked, his tone unrelenting. The boy opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His friends shifted uncomfortably, clearly ready to leave but unsure how to extract themselves. As Jason watched the boy struggle, memories flickered in his mind, memories of other young men, cocky and brash, who'd walked into combat zones thinking they were invincible. He'd seen their fear when reality hit, when they realized the stakes were life and death. Some had risen to the challenge, finding strength they didn't know they had. Others had crumbled, their arrogance stripped away to reveal the scared kids underneath. This boy reminded Jason of the latter type, someone who talked big but had never faced real adversity. Jason had no intention of crushing him, but he wasn't going to let the kid walk away without learning something. The leader's friends were practically tugging at his sleeves now, their whispers more urgent. "Let's go, man. This isn't worth it." Jason took one last sip of his coffee, setting the cup down with deliberate precision. "Listen to your friends," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "They're smarter than you're giving them credit for." The boy's jaw worked silently for a moment, his fists clenching and unclenching. Finally, with a muttered curse, he turned on his heel and stormed toward the door. His friends followed, one of them glancing back at Jason with a sheepish nod. The cafe exhaled collectively, the tension dissipating like a storm cloud breaking apart. Jason remained seated, his gaze following the boys as they disappeared down the street. He wasn't angry, nor was he smug about the outcome. He felt a pang of pity for the leader, whose bravado masked a deeper insecurity that Jason could only guess at. The barista approached cautiously, her hands gripping a tray of mugs. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. Jason nodded. "I'm fine." She hesitated, then added, "That was impressive. The way you handled them." Jason gave her a small smile. "Sometimes, the best way to win is not to fight at all." She nodded, but Jason could tell she didn't fully understand. How could she? Most people didn't know what it meant to weigh every action like it could save or cost a life. As the barista walked away, Jason turned his attention back to the table, his mind replaying the encounter. He hadn't just defused a tense situation, he'd observed something important. The leader's tremble, the friends' hesitation, the subtle cracks in their unity. These weren't just random details. They were pieces of a larger puzzle, one that Jason's instincts told him wasn't finished yet. Jason decided it was time to leave. He finished his coffee, placed a tip on the table, and wheeled himself toward the exit. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. As he made his way to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over. The boys might have left, but something about their leader's lingering anger felt unresolved. Jason's instincts, honed through years of danger, whispered that trouble had a way of circling back. He paused at the curb, scanning the street with a soldier's vigilance. The neighborhood seemed quiet, but Jason knew better than to let his guard down. "Always watch your six," he muttered to himself, a habit from his Navy SEAL days. And then, as he rolled toward his car, he caught a flash of movement in the corner of his eye. As Jason rolled toward his car, the flash of movement caught his attention. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see without making it obvious he was looking. A shadow shifted behind a parked van across the street. His years of training told him that this wasn't just a random passerby, it was deliberate. Jason kept moving, his pace steady, as if he hadn't noticed anything. The key fob was in his pocket, and with a subtle press, he unlocked his car. He reached the door, his hand on the handle, but he didn't get in. Instead, he paused, pretending to adjust something on his chair, giving himself a moment to assess. The shadow moved again, this time closer. Jason's grip tightened on the chair's armrest. His instincts were screaming now. This wasn't over. "Hey, old man." The voice came from behind him. Jason straightened, turning slowly to face the boy from the cafe, the leader. He was alone this time, his friends nowhere in sight. But Jason wasn't fooled. He knew better than to assume the kid had come back without backup. The boy swaggered toward him, trying to look confident, but Jason noticed the same slight tremble in his hands as before. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" the boy sneered, stopping a few feet away. "Embarrassing me like that in front of everyone." Jason didn't respond right away. He studied the boy, his calm gaze steady. "You embarrassed yourself," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I just held up a mirror." The boy's face darkened, and he took a step closer. "You think you're tough? Sitting in that chair, acting like you're better than me?" Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he asked, "What do you want?" The boy hesitated, as if he hadn't expected the question. Then his scowl deepened. "I want you to know you don't scare me." Jason raised an eyebrow. "I'm not trying to scare you." "Yeah, right," the boy shot back, his voice rising. "You think you're so cool, acting all calm like you're untouchable. But you're nothing. You're just some broken old guy in a wheelchair." Jason felt the familiar pang of anger, but he pushed it aside. Anger wouldn't help him here. "If that's what you think," he said evenly, "then why are you so worked up?" The boy faltered, his bravado cracking. Jason could see it now. Beneath the anger was something else. Fear. Insecurity. Maybe even pain. "Look," Jason said, his tone softening just a fraction. "I don't know what your deal is, but picking fights isn't going to fix whatever's broken inside you." The boy's face twisted in a mix of confusion and rage. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right," Jason said. "I don't. But I know what it's like to feel angry at the world. To feel like you've got something to prove." The boy stared at him, his fists clenched, but he didn't move. Jason could tell his words were hitting a nerve, even if the kid didn't want to admit it. "I've been where you are," Jason continued, his voice steady. "And I can tell you this lashing out won't make it better. It'll just make it worse." Before the boy could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind the van. Jason's eyes flicked to the side as two more figures emerged, his lackeys from the cafe. They looked uneasy, their gazes darting between Jason and their leader. "Man, let's just go," one of them muttered. "This is stupid." "Shut up," the leader snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "I've got this." Jason sighed inwardly. The situation was escalating, and he needed to de-escalate it before someone did something they'd regret. "Listen," he said, addressing all three boys now. You don't want to do this. Walk away while you still can. The leader sneered, but Jason noticed the hesitation in his eyes. His friends, on the other hand, were clearly ready to bail. Come on, man, one of them said again, tugging at the leader's sleeve. This guy's not worth it. But the leader shrugged him off, his face twisting in frustration. I'm not backing down. Jason leaned forward slightly in his chair, his calm demeanor giving way to something colder. You think you know what a fight is, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't. But I do. And I'm telling you right now you don't want this. The boys froze, their bravado crumbling under the weight of Jason's words. There was no anger in his tone, no bluster. Just a quiet, unshakable certainty that came from experience. For a moment, no one moved. The street was silent except for the faint hum of traffic in the distance. Then, finally, the leader took a step back. His face was pale, his hands shaking visibly now. Whatever, man, he muttered, his voice hollow. You're not worth my time. He turned and stalked away, his friends trailing after him with obvious relief. Jason watched them go, his body still tense, ready for anything. When they disappeared around the corner, he let out a slow breath, his muscles relaxing slightly. He turned back to his car, but the moment he reached for the door handle, a voice behind him made him pause. Excuse me. Jason turned to see the barista from the cafe standing a few feet away, her hands clasped nervously. Are you okay? She asked, her voice tentative. Jason nodded. I'm fine. She hesitated, then added, that was intense. You handled it really well. Jason gave her a small, tired smile. Sometimes, the best fight is the one you don't have. She nodded, though her expression suggested she didn't fully understand. Well, if you ever need anything, just let us know. The cafe staff, I mean. We've got your back. Jason's smile widened just a fraction. Thanks, he said simply. As she walked away, Jason climbed into his car, his mind already shifting gears. The encounter had ended peacefully, but his instincts told him it wasn't over. The leader's anger hadn't disappeared, it had just been redirected. Jason had faced men like him before. And he knew that sometimes, a retreat wasn't a surrender. It was a regrouping. The air in the cafe was electric. The leader's hand hovered in midair, too stunned to react. His friends, who had previously been smirking and egging him on, were now wide-eyed and fidgeting nervously. Jason's steady glare was like a laser cutting through the boy's tough guy facade. Jason didn't break eye contact as he tapped the photo on the table with 2 fingers. You see that? He asked, his voice even and quiet. That's the man you're trying to mess with. The leader blinked, his mouth opening and closing as if words had failed him. Jason didn't wait for a reply. He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them. I've faced down trained killers in enemy territory, Jason continued, his tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. I've walked through hell and back for this country, for people like you. So believe me when I say, you don't scare me. Not even a little. Jason's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The leader's hand slowly dropped back to his side, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the truth. Jason didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or taunt. Instead, he picked up the photograph, sliding it back into his pocket with deliberate care. Strength isn't about who can yell the loudest or throw the first punch, Jason said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen more than most people could imagine. It's about knowing when to stand your ground and when to walk away. The leader flinched, his tough exterior now riddled with cracks. I didn't know, he stammered, but Jason cut him off with a raised hand. You didn't care, Jason corrected, his gaze unwavering. You thought I was an easy target because of this chair. Because I didn't fight back right away. But you were wrong. And here's a free lesson for you: underestimating people is a dangerous habit. One day, it's going to get you into trouble you can't talk your way out of. The leader's lackeys shuffled awkwardly behind him, clearly eager to leave but too afraid to be the first to run. Jason noticed their unease and decided to drive his point home. "You boys think this is a game?" Jason asked, his tone shifting from stern to icy. "Messing with people, trying to prove how tough you are? Let me tell you something: real toughness isn't about tearing others down. It's about lifting people up. It's about surviving, protecting, and doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Jason's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And if you're lucky, you'll never have to find out what it's like to face someone who doesn't stop when you beg for mercy. Because those people exist. I've met them. I've fought them. And trust me, you wouldn't last 5 seconds." The leader swallowed hard, his confidence completely shattered. His lackeys exchanged nervous glances before one of them finally muttered, "Let's go, man." But Jason wasn't finished. "Not so fast," he said, holding up a hand. The trio froze. "Before you leave, you're going to fix every chair you knocked over and apologize to the staff for disrupting their day. And you're going to mean it. Understand?" The leader hesitated, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. But one look at Jason's steely gaze was enough to make him think twice. Slowly, he nodded. "Good," Jason said, leaning back in his chair. "Now get to it." The cafe staff and customers watched in stunned silence as the three boys scrambled to pick up chairs and clean up their mess. The leader mumbled an apology to the barista, who looked both surprised and relieved. Jason didn't say another word. He simply sipped his coffee, his calm demeanor returning as if nothing had happened. As the boys slinked out of the cafe, the room buzzed with whispered conversations. Jason ignored it all, focusing on the last sip of his coffee. But then, a man in his mid-40s approached his table. He was wearing a sharp business suit and carried himself with quiet authority. "Excuse me," the man said, his tone respectful. "I couldn't help but overhear." That was impressive. Jason glanced up, his expression neutral. "I wasn't trying to impress anyone." The man nodded. "I understand. But what you did back there, teaching those boys a lesson without resorting to violence, that takes real strength." Jason gave a small shrug. "They're kids. Stupid, reckless kids. They don't need someone to beat them down, they need someone to show them what real character looks like." The man smiled faintly. "You remind me of someone I used to know. A commanding officer I served under. He always said the same thing." Jason's gaze sharpened. "You served?" "Marine Corps," the man replied, extending a hand. "Colonel Mark Harris, retired." Jason shook his hand firmly, a flicker of respect passing between them. "Jason Reed. Navy SEAL." Colonel Harris hesitated, as if debating something. Finally, he said, "Listen, I run a leadership program for troubled youth. Kids who've been through the system, who don't have anyone to guide them. What I saw here today. You've got a gift, Jason. The way you handled those boys, it's exactly what these kids need." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Are you offering me a job?" Harris chuckled. "I'm offering you a chance to make a difference. To take everything you've been through and use it to help others." Jason leaned back, considering the offer. He had spent years trying to find purpose after leaving the SEALs. Maybe this was it. "I'll think about it," Jason said finally. "That's all I ask," Harris replied, handing him a business card. As Jason rolled out of the cafe and into the sunlight, he felt a strange sense of peace. The confrontation with the bullies was over, but something bigger had happened. He had stood his ground, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated. and maybe, just maybe, he had found a new mission. Sometimes, Jason murmured to himself, the fight finds you for a reason. With that, he tucked the business card into his jacket and wheeled himself toward a future that suddenly seemed a little brighter. Jason rolled out of the cafe with a calm demeanor, but his mind buzzed with the events of the last hour. He hadn't planned for any of this. A quiet coffee, a chance to reflect on life, turned into a showdown he hadn't asked for. As his hands gripped the wheels of his chair and propelled him forward down the uneven sidewalk, a part of him wanted to leave it all behind. The bullies, the spectacle, the memories their words had dragged up. But there was something about Colonel Harris's words that lingered. You've got a gift, Jason. He paused by a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. The card Harris had given him burned in his pocket, a physical weight for a decision that would not come easily. Helping troubled kids. Sure, it sounded noble. But Jason wasn't sure he was the guy for the job. His life had been about precision, discipline, and survival. Could that translate to working with teenagers who didn't respect anyone, let alone a stranger in a wheelchair? The rhythmic sound of his wheels against the pavement pulled Jason into memories he usually kept locked away. He saw the faces of his SEAL team, brothers who had fought beside him and shared laughter in the bleakest of circumstances. He remembered the adrenaline of missions, the unshakable bond of trust, and the weight of responsibility. And he remembered the explosion. It came back to him in flashes, the fiery blast, the ear-splitting roar, the sharp agony of shrapnel ripping through his legs. The pain had been unbearable, but worse was waking up in a hospital bed to the realization that his old life was gone. He had fought hard to rebuild, to adapt, to survive. But even now, years later, Jason sometimes felt like he was still on that battlefield, fighting a war within himself. So, why now? Why did Harris's offer stir something in him? Jason didn't have the answer yet, but he knew one thing: he couldn't ignore it. Jason was about 3 blocks from his apartment when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. He tensed instinctively, his training kicking in. Hey! Wait up, a voice called. Jason turned slightly and saw the barista from the cafe jogging toward him. She was in her mid-20s, with curly brown hair tucked into a messy bun and a look of determination on her face. Forgot something? Jason asked, arching an eyebrow as she came to a stop beside him. Not exactly, she replied, catching her breath. I wanted to say thanks. Jason tilted his head. For what? For standing up to those guys, she said, her voice earnest. I mean, nobody else was going to. And it wasn't just about you, they were ruining everyone's morning. It takes guts to do what you did. Jason shrugged. Just did what anyone else would have. Not true, she said firmly. Most people would have stayed quiet. But you didn't. She hesitated, then added, look, I don't know what your story is, but you've got this presence. Like, you know how to handle things. People notice that. I noticed that. Jason studied her for a moment, unsure how to respond. Thanks, I guess, he said finally. She smiled. Anyway, I just wanted you to know that it mattered. To me, at least. With that, she turned and headed back toward the cafe, leaving Jason alone with his thoughts once more. Her words echoed in Jason's mind as he continued his journey home. It mattered. For years, Jason had questioned his place in the world. After the SEALs, his life had felt directionless, as if all the skills and experiences he had gained were now useless. But today, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had made a difference. And it wasn't just about scaring off a few bullies. It was about showing strength in a way that inspired respect rather than fear. As Jason reached his apartment building, he pulled out Harris's card and stared at it. The embossed lettering seemed to challenge him, daring him to take the next step. Maybe it's worth a shot, Jason thought. The next morning, Jason found himself sitting at his small kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. Harris's card lay beside the computer, its pristine surface stark against the scratched wood. Jason hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. What would he even say? Finally, he typed a short email. Subject, follow-up. Colonel Harris. This is Jason Reed. We met yesterday at the cafe. I've been thinking about your offer, and I'd like to learn more about the program you run. Let me know when you're available to talk. Regards. Jason Reed. He read the email over twice before hitting send. The moment he did, a mixture of relief and apprehension washed over him. Now all he could do was wait. The reply came faster than Jason expected. Within an hour, Harris had responded, suggesting they meet at a local community center the following afternoon. When Jason arrived, he was greeted by the sight of a small gym filled with kids ranging in age from early teens to late 20s. They were playing basketball, working on group projects, and chatting in clusters. The atmosphere was loud but not chaotic, a controlled kind of energy. Harris spotted Jason and waved him over. Glad you came, he said, shaking Jason's hand. Jason glanced around. Busy place. Harris grinned. Keeps them off the streets. Most of these kids come from rough backgrounds, broken homes, trouble with the law, you name it. They need structure. Guidance. Someone to show them they can be better. And you think I'm that someone? Jason asked skeptically. I know you are, Harris said firmly. You've got experience they can respect. And after what I saw yesterday, I know you've got the patience and wisdom to handle them. Harris introduced Jason to a few of the kids, a wiry teenager named Malik who had been caught stealing cars but was now training to be a mechanic, a quiet girl named Sophia who had a knack for drawing but lacked confidence, and a burly young man named Andre who had been in and out of juvie before finding an outlet in weightlifting. Each story tugged at something deep within Jason. These kids weren't bad, they were lost. And suddenly, Jason saw a bit of himself in them, the anger, the frustration, the longing for direction. He spent the afternoon observing, occasionally stepping in to offer advice or encouragement. By the end of the day, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. As Jason left the community center, Harris walked him to the door. So? Harris asked, a knowing smile on his face. Jason nodded slowly. You were right. This feels like something I can do. Harris clapped him on the shoulder. Welcome to the team. Jason wheeled himself out into the evening air, a faint smile playing on his lips. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. Because sometimes, life gave you a second chance. And Jason wasn't about to waste his. Jason sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle. The cafe around him began to hum with life again, though now the conversations were quieter, more subdued. People stole glances his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity, respect, and perhaps a little guilt. The barista lingered for a moment. I'm sorry you had to go through that, she said softly. But, the way you handled it? That was incredible. Jason didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his mind elsewhere. While the immediate threat had passed, the incident stirred old emotions he'd worked hard to bury. He wasn't angry, anger had no place in his life anymore, but there was a heaviness in his chest, a familiar ache that came from years of being underestimated and judged. As Jason sipped his coffee, he noticed an older man across the room give him a subtle nod of approval. A mother at a nearby table whispered something to her young son, who turned and gave Jason a shy thumbs up. Jason's lips twitched into a faint smile. He didn't need applause or recognition, but the quiet gestures of respect were enough. The cafe's manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached his table next. Thank you, she said, her voice warm but firm. I've seen those boys come in here before, causing trouble. None of us knew how to handle it. What you did, she shook her head. You taught them a lesson they'll remember. Jason looked up at her, his gaze steady. Sometimes, people just need to be reminded that actions have consequences. The manager nodded, placing a hand on the back of the chair across from him. If there's anything we can do, anything at all, you let us know. Jason offered a polite smile. Just keep serving good coffee. That's all I need. As the cafe settled back into its routine, Jason finished his coffee and began to wheel himself toward the exit. Just as he reached the door, a deep voice called out behind him. Excuse me, sir. Jason turned, spotting a man in his early 40s walking briskly toward him. The man wore a neatly pressed suit and had the confident demeanor of someone used to being in charge. I saw what happened back there, the man said, extending his hand. Name's Thomas Carter. I'm a local business owner. Jason shook his hand, his grip firm but measured. Jason Reed. Well, Mr. Reed, Carter continued, I've been sitting over there, watching all of this unfold. I have to say, the way you handled those kids, impressive doesn't even begin to cover it. Jason shrugged. Just did what needed to be done. Carter chuckled. You make it sound simple, but most people wouldn't have had the guts to stand up like that. Look, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I run a mentorship program for young men in the city. A lot of them come from rough neighborhoods, and they've had, let's just say, limited positive influences in their lives. I think someone like you could make a real difference. Jason blinked, caught off guard. I'm not sure I'm the right guy for something like that, he said carefully. Carter smiled. I think you're exactly the right guy. You've got a presence, a strength that can't be taught. And if you're willing, I'd love to talk more about what you could bring to the program. Jason hesitated, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair. I'll think about it, he said finally. That's all I ask, Carter replied, handing him a business card. When you're ready, give me a call. As Jason rolled out into the crisp afternoon air, Carter's words lingered in his mind. He'd spent so much of the past few years focusing on surviving, on rebuilding himself piece by piece, that the idea of helping others hadn't crossed his mind. Could he really make a difference? Did he even want to try? His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice calling out from behind him. Mr. Reed. Jason turned to see the young barista jogging toward him, her cheeks flushed from the cold. I just wanted to say thanks again, she said, slightly out of breath. I mean, what you did in there, it wasn't just about you. You stood up for all of us. Jason gave her a small nod. Glad I could help. She hesitated, then added, you know, my little brother's in high school, and he's been having a tough time lately. Kids can be cruel, and, well, he could use someone like you in his corner. Jason frowned slightly. What do you mean? She looked down, twisting her hands nervously. He's different. Quiet, shy. The kind of kid bullies love to pick on. I try to help, but sometimes it feels like it's not enough. Seeing what you did today, though, it gives me hope that maybe things can change. Jason felt a pang of recognition. He'd been that kid once, the one who didn't quite fit, the one who had to fight twice as hard to prove himself. And now, here was an opportunity to be the kind of role model he'd once needed. I'll think about it, he said, his voice soft but resolute. As Jason wheeled himself home, he passed a small alleyway and caught a glimpse of the boys from earlier. They were slumped against a graffiti-covered wall, their cocky attitudes replaced with quiet shame. The leader's backwards cap was gone, and his shoulders were hunched as he stared at the ground. Jason stopped, his instincts telling him to keep moving but something else urging him to stay. The leader looked up, his face pale. We're sorry, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Jason studied him for a long moment. "What are you going to do about it?" he asked finally. The boy blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you can apologize all you want, but words don't mean much without action. You want to make it right? Start by treating people with respect." The boy nodded slowly, the weight of Jason's words sinking in. "We will. I promise." Jason held his gaze for another second before nodding. "Good. Don't let me catch you doing this again." By the time Jason reached his apartment, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. He pulled Carter's card from his pocket and stared at it for a long moment. The idea of stepping into a mentorship role still felt daunting, but maybe it was time to stop looking inward and start looking outward. He placed the card on his kitchen counter and turned to the window, watching as the city lights flickered to life. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt a sense of peace and maybe even purpose. Sometimes, justice wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic fights. Sometimes, it was about small moments of courage and kindness, rippling outward to create change. And Jason Reed was ready to be part of that change. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street as the bullies stumbled away, their heads down, their arrogance drained. They had learned the hard way that strength wasn't just about physical power or intimidation, it was about resilience, about facing the worst life could throw at you and standing tall in the aftermath. Jason had proven that. They had come into the cafe with their jokes and their sneers, but now they were walking out with nothing but the weight of their own arrogance to carry. Jason's eyes followed them for a moment longer, then he turned back to the inside of the cafe, where the mood had shifted. People were going back to their business, but there was a new atmosphere in the air, one of quiet respect. The barista behind the counter was wiping down a table with a calm, measured hand. A couple of regulars who had been watching the whole thing gave Jason a subtle nod, as if they were acknowledging something unspoken. He didn't need any words or thanks. His actions had already spoken louder than any applause ever could. Jason wasn't a man who craved attention or recognition. The battles he had fought in his past, the ones no one could see, had taught him a different kind of strength. It was the strength of patience, the strength of knowing when to stand tall and when to remain silent. The kind of strength that wasn't about making noise, but about making a difference. As the quiet hum of the cafe settled back into a normal rhythm, Jason felt a strange peace. There was no triumph in his heart, no bitterness toward the young men who had dared to challenge him. They had acted out of ignorance, and now they were faced with the consequences of that ignorance. In the end, that was all that mattered. Justice wasn't about vengeance, it was about understanding, growth, and, above all, respect. "Never judge a man by what you see," Jason muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. He had learned this lesson the hard way. Life had a way of stripping you of your defenses, leaving you vulnerable and exposed. But it also had a way of revealing your true strength when you least expected it. You could never know what someone had been through, what they had survived, just by looking at them. He thought back to the times when he had been the one underestimated, the one written off as weak. Back when he was in the hospital, with bandages wrapping his body and the pain still fresh from the bomb that had torn his legs away, he had been written off. People saw a broken man, a soldier who had lost everything. But they hadn't seen the spirit inside him. They hadn't seen the determination, the sheer will to rebuild himself piece by piece. Those same people had looked at him as if he was less than human, as if his wheelchair defined him. They didn't know the years he had spent training, pushing himself past limits others couldn't even imagine. They didn't know about the hell he had been through, the way he had fought to survive, not just physically but mentally. Jason had faced the darkest corners of war, and now he was facing the harshest corner of life in his own city, where people like the bullies in the cafe thought they could break him with a few words. The thing about being underestimated is that it forces you to be resourceful. It teaches you how to observe, how to bide your time. Jason had spent years refining this skill. He didn't have to react right away. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. All he had to do was wait for the right moment to show his strength, not with anger, not with fists, but with calm, collected power. That moment had come in the cafe, and the bullies had learned that lesson the hard way. They had expected a man in a wheelchair to be an easy target. They thought he was weak, that he would crumble under the pressure. But Jason hadn't. Instead, he had shown them what true strength looked like: quiet, steady, unshakable. It wasn't in the way he reacted or how he handled the confrontation. It was in the way he carried himself. It was the years of unspoken pain, the wisdom from his past, that had made the difference. Jason glanced out the window again, watching the world go by. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to twinkle faintly in the sky. A chill breeze fluttered through the open door, and the sound of distant traffic hummed in the background. He could feel the weight of the day lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to test him, and it wouldn't be the last. But he had learned long ago not to react impulsively, not to let the actions of others dictate his own. In the quiet of the cafe, Jason felt a subtle shift within himself. He wasn't just a man in a wheelchair anymore. He wasn't just a soldier who had seen too much. He was a man who had faced his darkest fears and had come out the other side stronger. He was a man who had learned that there was more to strength than muscle, more to power than aggression. Strength was quiet. Strength was patient. Strength was knowing that no matter what life threw at you, you would always stand tall. As Jason wheeled himself toward the door to leave, a final thought passed through his mind, one that had been growing in him over the course of the day. Sometimes, the greatest victories weren't the ones that came with loud cheers or grand gestures. Sometimes, they were the quiet moments, the ones when you held your ground in the face of cruelty and walked away without ever raising a fist. The bullies had learned that lesson today. But maybe, just maybe, Jason had learned something too. He had learned that no matter how many people doubted him, no matter how many times he had been pushed aside or written off, he could always rise again. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. He was more than the man in the wheelchair. He was a survivor, a fighter, and most importantly, he was someone who had the power to change the way people saw the world. Jason took one last look at the cafe, then wheeled himself into the street. The evening air was crisp against his face, but he felt a warmth inside him, a quiet fire that had been rekindled, a flame of hope and strength. There was still much work to be done. There were still battles to be fought. But Jason knew one thing for certain: no matter what came next, he would face it with the same dignity, the same quiet power, that had carried him through every challenge in his life. Never judge a man by what you see, he repeated to himself. Because you never know what he's already survived. And with that, Jason Reed rolled down the street, ready for whatever came next, knowing that he had already won the greatest battle of all, the battle to never let the world define him.